I started watching a limited series on Netflix called Turning Point, The Bomb and the Cold War. And it's very good. I think it's very well made. I watched the series of the same title, Turning Point, about World War Two. What these documentaries do is they use archival footage and interviews, and I feel the way it's presented is very creative. It's very engaging. And I think very relevant in today's world, particularly this series with the World War Two one we've just seen. This month marks the 80th anniversary of the end of that conflict. The particular series have naturally went on to that, World War Two, Cold War. They also have one on the Vietnam War, which I'll probably watch as well. It's got 5 episodes. Anyway, very well made. So if you have Netflix, do check it out. Each episode's about an hour. This one has 8 episodes, I believe. But the first episode, it started off looking at the contemporary situation in Ukraine and Putin's worldview and ideology. I'm going to say it right now. I do believe that we're in a second Cold War. I don't think it's really a question anymore. Historians may look at this, and I think there'll be debate over whether it is that and what the sort of starting point is. But I think it's almost seems petty not to consider it that. I mean, what else is it? If you have major powers that don't trust one another, that are nuclear states that have this constant series of tensions and geopolitical crises, I think that's, to me, that has a lot of hallmarks of the last Cold War. Let's look at timelines a bit here. I think most people would accept that the last Cold War's timeline would be 1946 to 1991, i.e., the beginnings of the Soviet US tensions just after World War II, coinciding with the Manhattan Project, and then getting onto the space race, and then ending with the dissolution of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day, 1991, I believe it was, exact ending, leading then to the reunification of Germany. And then the 1990s brought certainly some crises, like the breakup of Yugoslavia and the brutal wars that followed in the Balkans, but also optimism with a reunified Germany, with opportunities. However, for many Russians, the 90s is seen as a bad time. It's seen as a time of rising corruption and crime. And then we get into the 21st century and the rise of Putinism. Um, so if there is, if this term, the Second Cold War, is to be accepted, when did it begin? Um, One would be tempted to say that Putin's always been Putin. So arguably from the 1st of January 2000, when he became Russian president, de facto, Yeltsin made a big thing by resigning on New Year's Eve, the last day of the millennium. Um, but perhaps we can look at certain points. Um, with Britain and Russia, there's been tensions for the best part of 20 years. I would argue at least since the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. We can look at other incidents. There's been numerous espionage scandals, but until recent years, they were relatively contained. There was the 2008 Georgia War when Russian forces attacked Georgia as the Beijing opening ceremony began, the Beijing Olympics that year. There has been numerous other conflicts that Russia has been involved in, such as propping up the Assad regime. Um, Perhaps the annexation of Crimea could be seen as a starting point, a start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Um, and if there's a definitive starting point, if there's a most dramatic starting point, it would be definitely the 24th of February 2022, the full-on Russian invasion of Ukraine. But whatever the starting point is, um, the tensions between Putin and the West are palpable, very real, and very, it's not even, I think it's actually almost worse than the Cold War in the sense that with with leaders like Brezhnev and Khrushchev, there was mistrust and there was always that threat of nuclear war, and it was dangerous. But I think the West could sort of have a working relationship with those leaders. That was the case with Putin early on, and I think Trump is very mercurial. But with Putin and European leaders, and Putin and Zelensky, it's the relationship is almost non-existent. So I think it's almost worse than the Cold War, the last Cold War. I think it's a situation that is very, very dangerous because you have a president in the United States who's mercurial and um, unpredictable. You have a Russian leader who's fueled by ultranationalism. And remember, Russia is a nuclear state. It's got more nuclear warheads than anyone. Um, the overall number of nuclear warheads in the world is significantly less than the peak of the Cold War. But a nuclear warhead is a nuclear warhead, whether it's one or 500. Um, we often hear, about World War III scenarios, and this has been brought up many, many times. Every time there's an international crisis, you hear these, um, you hear rhetoric about it's World War III. Whether it be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether it be Hamas attacking Israel and the beginning of that crisis. You also find these standoffs between nation states. For example, whenever India and Pakistan have a flare up, or whenever there's saber rattling in the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea. Um, you know, that's another part of the world that, because of all of this focus on Ukraine and the Middle East, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact there's significant tensions in the Far East as well. So what we have in the world right now is a very major war going on in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. We have the crisis in the Middle East. I mean, you could argue there's always a crisis in the Middle East, but it's particularly bad right now. The first real direct conflict between Israel and Iran in recent years. Um, and there is a real fear that China may at any point attack Taiwan. So I don't think it's hyperbole to say we're at the most dangerous point, certainly since the last Cold War, and arguably since World War II. I mean, it's important not to get into hyperbole, but really, look at who's running the world right now. The most powerful leaders in the world are all demagogues. Xi Jinping in China, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Donald Trump in the United States. None of them are moderate. Putin and Xi are brutal dictators, and Trump, in my view, is a wannabe dictator. And he's very mercurial. I think Trump is potentially dangerous because we just don't know what sort of angle he's going to take. I've just watched a clip from that meeting with the European leaders, and Ursula von der Leyen was making a very valid point about kidnapped children. Now, some might well point to her support of Israel and say that she's a hypocrite, and there may be some basis to that, but she was right to call to attention this appalling crime that Russia has kidnapped thousands of children, and Trump kind of skipped over that point. He didn't really address it. Um, there's been a bit of clickbait about Trump clashing with Friedrich Merz of Germany. Merz has made the point that there has to be pressure put on Putin. And this gets back to my point about those Putin supporters coming out of their gutters online. A lot of comments on the video that I was watching were attacking Merz, and making jokes about the Third Reich and so on. I think Friedrich Merz is absolutely right to say pressure should be put on Putin. It's Russia that's the aggressor in this war, without question. Now, there's been some things coming out of these meetings that may be good for Ukraine. Trump has agreed that Zelensky has to be involved in talks. Trump has agreed that there can be no peace so long as is, firing drones at Ukraine. So there has been certain positive signs that that Trump is starting to change his rhetoric a little bit and finally recognize who the aggressor is. Um, Putin was very smug at that meeting in Alaska. He may not be smiling now. So, those who say that Putin's a very strong leader may be deceived. Putin may not be as strong as he appears. I do think one of the biggest mistakes of that Alaska summit was it was giving Putin a platform, a sense of respect that he does not deserve on American soil. And, anti-Europeans will look at this and say, oh, it's a bloody nose for the Europeans. They're looking foolish. And, there's been a lot of commentary about the fact that they've went to Washington almost looking like um, school children being reprimanded by a headmaster. And it's hard not to avoid the optics of them lining out up outside the Oval Office. And, some might say it's a PR coup for Putin and Trump. But I think in the last few days, maybe Putin won't be smiling so much because um, Trump has actually been agreeing with Zelensky in some of these areas. Zelensky, I think, um, has had to bite his tongue, bite his, yeah, what's the expression? Yeah, bite his tongue really from knowing full well how he was gaslit at the last meeting. Um, but let's see what happens. I mean, Putin may not be in the sort of upper hand people are portraying that he's in. These Putin shells that come out, like I say, a lot of them are in the global south. I do not understand why they are defending someone like Putin. I don't understand it. Maybe because of anti-West sentiment, who knows? But I really have nothing but contempt for Putin shells because they are thoroughly ignorant as to the situation on the ground. But the point I would make to them is whatever you think of Macron or Merz or Starmer or other European leaders, okay, you may not like them, but what is your contempt for the Ukrainians? What have the Ukrainian people ever done to you? It honestly disgusts me, the callousness shown towards the Ukrainian people from outsiders who are clearly ignorant about the situation. Russia is the aggressor in all of this. Um, and for that reason, I think the German Chancellor is right to point out that there should be pressure put on Putin. I think it's repulsive that people think that the overture should be made to Putin, that the pressure should be put on the victims, that Putin should get what he wants. Let's be very clear, Putin doesn't even recognize Ukrainian sovereignty. So this speculation of a Putin-Zelensky meeting, the Ukrainians have abided by ceasefires. Russia hasn't. And, with that sort of meeting, what's Trump going to ask Zelensky to do? I mean, I'm proud at this time to be a European. Um, because I feel that European leaders have recognized who the aggressor is. I'm not sure that Trump has fully. I am encouraged the fact he's toughened his rhetoric a little bit recently, but that's matched with the fact he brought Putin to American soil. So I don't know how this is all going to play out, but um, yeah, we are in another Cold War, and Trump's not going to be in power forever. 3 years from now, he'll be out of office. JD Vance may be president. So how's JD Vance going to play it? So far, he's shown that he's just as much of a Putin appeaser as Trump is. So how's it going to play out? If there's a radical change and the Democrats actually get into power, let's say we have a President Newsom, I think that would be very encouraging because I think someone like Gavin Newsom, who knows, Harris might try a run at the Oval Office again. And if she is successful, she'll certainly take a different stance than Trump. That would be very encouraging because I don't think, history shows us that you cannot placate Putin. All it does is embolden his aggression. I think, like all bullies, at some point they will back down, if not completely, at least somewhat. But so long as Putin is in power, I don't think we can trust Russia. That's just a no-brainer. You have Russian ultranationals on a daily basis threatening nuclear war against European cities. So it's delusional and deranged to say that we should, pander to Putin and respect Putin. No, we shouldn't. Now, be absolutely certain, for all these mocking comments about European leaders, NATO NATO is significantly more powerful than Russia. And yes, it's a group of nations as opposed to one country, but you put NATO and Russia head to head, it's no contest. NATO soars above Russia in pretty much every measure. So, for all its rhetoric, I don't think Russia would be actually stupid enough to do something. Putin's bombastic. Russian nationalists have a lot of hot air. But it's a little bit like Khrushchev talking about a 100 megaton nuclear bomb, which they never had. The Tsar Bomba was estimated to be 50 megatons, which was a frightening power. It was by far the most um, powerful nuclear device ever detonated. The second was Castle Bravo, which I think was 15 megatons, so significantly less than the Tsar Bomba. But I'm just making the point that Khrushchev was boasting about a 100 megaton nuclear bomb. Um, so in the case of Russia, we hear the term paper tiger for China. There may be a paper bear with Russia. Russia is a powerful country, but it's not as powerful as it sometimes as these Russian nationalists imply. The Russian military has been severely damaged. The Russian economy is in a very bad way. Russia's got very few genuine friends. So Russia shouldn't be dismissed, but it's not as powerful as some of the Putin chills would like to imply. And Putin's in his early 70s. He's not going to be around forever. Most Russian leaders don't make it to their 80s. All those old Soviet leaders, they all died in their 70s. I'm not sure, I don't think any of them made it to their 80s. You know, um, Russian men aren't exactly known for having a healthy lifestyle. And I know Putin's not a big drinker, but there was speculation a while back that he had cancer. Who knows? But he's not going to be around forever. And when he goes, whether it be from natural causes, whether it be from a successful coup, at some point Putin is going to go. And then the direction of Russia is going to be a big question. If Sergei Lavrov takes over, well, Lavrov's 75 now. He's slightly older than Putin, so that's unlikely. If a Russian nationalist takes over, there's none of them right now that are as well known as Putin. So, like I said in my previous video, they will lack that sort of personality cult. So, there's going to be a real power struggle in Russia. I don't think it's inconceivable that Russia at some point will actually break up the way the Soviet Union did. In other words, Russia's just too big for its own good. I mean, it's a vast country, 17 million square kilometers. Maybe it's just too damn big. And that could actually be its Achilles heel. So, how does this play out? Let's just use a starting point 2014. If we use that as a starting point, then the new Cold War has been going on for 11 years. The last one was 46 years. I don't think it will be that long, but I think the world is in a dangerous situation. If China invades Taiwan, how will that play out? There's so much uncertainty when Donald Trump's in the White House. If there was a sort of centrist Democrat president in the White House, it would be more of a conventional situation. Someone like Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and who knows if Newsom becomes president, he's going to have a struggle because his record in California is nothing to shout about. So I think he will have a struggle, but anything could happen in 2028. If it's Vance, he'll likely continue a lot of Trump's foreign policy. But the one good thing is Vance doesn't have Trump's personality cult. There's no real MAGA movement with Vance, not in the same way. Um, so we'll see how things play out. But I'll just reiterate my thoughts on this. Shame on all Putin shills. There's something I think pathologically wrong with someone who supports a genocidal dictator whose forces kidnap children, rape women, torture prisoners of war, and inflict carnage and misery on millions of people. To hell with Putin and to hell with his apologists.